So, as I said, our topic this morning is the importance of words. It's a question that humanistic Judaism has grappled with for quite a long time. But we're not the only ones that have grappled with what do words mean and does it matter what words mean. If you go back 200 years ago, the first attempts at reforming or changing Judaism took place in Germany. And one of their challenges was what to do with the traditional prayer book. For one thing, the services were too long. There were plenty of prayers that were repeated 2 times, 3 times. The Kaddish showed up multiple times in any one service, and so on. So they wanted to cut down on the length. It felt too long. They also wanted to understand what was being said, because the prayers were in Hebrew and they didn't always understand what was going on. They were learning German and speaking German in their daily lives. Why not find a way to include at least some of language they understood in a prayer service? If the goal was to inspire them, rote recitation didn't seem to do it anymore. And then when they wanted to learn what the words meant, that was another challenge. It's the same challenge the Catholic Church ran into about 50 years ago. When they translated the liturgy from Latin into the vernacular languages, all of a sudden people said, I was saying that? We're still saying that? So the Reform movement began to change what was said in the prayer services. They cut out certain prayers, calling for the restoration of animal sacrifices, believing in a personal Messiah who would be a king and reestablish a Jewish kingdom. If the goal was to become an integrated citizen of Germany or France or the United States, having a loyalty to another place and another political alliance at some point in the future was felt to be problematic. And they also wanted to adapt some of the texts that referred to Jewish chosenness. Because again, when you're getting along in a multi-ethnic experience, saying we're better than everybody else is not necessarily designed to win friends and influence people. So the Reform movement began this process of editing and changing the text. But as I think about it now, they didn't begin that process either. The very idea of creating fixed texts for prayers, telling people exactly what to say and when and how, is a process that developed over the course of Jewish life. There's a whole tractate of the Talmud, which is a collection of rabbinic law that was collected around the year 500 of the Common Era, but includes discussions that happened a few hundred years before. In this Talmud, there's a whole tractate, a whole section called Barachot, blessings. And in that tractate, they're discussing what should the blessing formula be. What counts as a blessing? Can you say the blessings in Aramaic or in your other language that you speak every day, or does the blessing have to be in Hebrew? Does the blessing have to refer to God as a king, the concept of malchut, kingship? Or can it simply refer to the creator or the source of this? Can you just say, wow, this is some great bread? Is that enough? What that means to us, of course, is that at some point, people wrote these texts. They do not go back to Moses on Sinai. They are not quoted directly from the Bible. They were written by rabbis at a certain period in time. They were eventually canonized and made into a fixed formula. But at some point, they were created by people to serve their needs and beliefs. And so if we think we are the equal of past generations and not some kind of lower level of holiness or importance, then maybe we as the heirs to this Jewish culture have not only the right, but perhaps also the responsibility to examine those texts, to find what speaks to us, and to be willing to explore possible changes. I'll give you just one other example of another group in Jewish life even today that is dealing with the same question, and that is Jewish feminism. Going back to the 1970s now, a whole generation, Jewish feminists began to wonder, why is God always referred to as male? Now in English, you is gender neutral, but in Hebrew, there's a you for boys and a you for girls. And the formula that's used in a traditional blessing is Baruch Atah, that Atah is you for male. And you don't hear Brucha At, blessed are you, the feminine form for you. Also, God is referred to as a Melech, as a king, not a Malkah, a queen. So if God is Atah, you, male, and a Melech, a king, why can't we explore what would be involved in trying it out in a feminine form? Now the response by the establishment was, ah! you're bringing back polytheism and goddess worship and all this. And the women would say, but you're saying male forms all the, oh, that's the generic. Male is the generic form, but female is specific. Well, you understand that we've come a long way in that discussion, but even today there are Jewish feminist groups, circles, individuals who are not as comfortable only using the Baruch Atah formula. They prefer something else, or mixing and matching, or doing sometimes one and sometimes the other. You may have even seen this in English prose. You know, it used to be the generic of a child goes to school and he meets his teacher and he brings his books. What you'll find now is a child goes to school, he meets his teacher, she brings her books. You simply alternate back and forth to include multiple experiences. So we're not the only ones who are asking these questions of, are these words expressing what is meaningful to me? And do we have the authority to make changes, to modify, to adapt, to create new ones? So we're part of a long process of change, going back to the first rabbis who invented them, to the reformers 200 years ago who began the process of a systematic change to the prayer book, and even into our own days where Jewish feminists are grappling with the very words, one word at a time, that are part of the rhythms and celebrations of Jewish life. So that's where we're starting from. Now, the first word I want to explore of how we define or don't define it is the word rabbi. After all, I use the title rabbi. Sherwin Wine, our founding thinker, used the title rabbi. We have a rabbinic program that the International Institute runs to ordain our own rabbis, both here and in Israel. But if you ask people on the street, what does a rabbi look like, or who is a rabbi? You might get answers something like this. This is actually the result if you search for rabbi image on Google. So this is the answer Google provides of what is a rabbi. And what do you notice here about this? Male, often older, wearing hats, particularly the black, either black yarmulke or black sort of brimmed hat that's distinctive of Orthodoxy, beards, okay. So I meet a couple of these criteria, that I have a white beard and I'm not young, as I used to be, and I'm male. But there are plenty of other pieces of this that I don't fit. And it also doesn't reflect the reality of what's happening out there for the vast majority of American Jews. Remember, the vast majority of American Jews are not Orthodox. Orthodoxy represents 15, maybe 20% of the Jews in America, and that's being generous. So that's 80% of American Jews are not Orthodox. If you look at these seminaries that train non-Orthodox rabbis, conservative, reform, reconstructionist, humanistic, and unaffiliated with a movement seminaries, over 50% of the rabbinic students today are women, and have been for a decade. So what a rabbi looks like, if you go into a typical non-Orthodox synagogue, may well not look anything like this. Not the black hat, not the beard, not the Orthodox, and not male. But our conceptual framework hasn't necessarily adjusted to that. What do we mean by a rabbi in secular humanistic Judaism? Well, I will say that it was a controversial topic when we started our rabbinic program, because we had a body of people who were involved in our movement, who identified as secular Jews, and part of their secularism was a kind of anti-religion. We don't want religious authorities, we don't call it a congregation, we don't even want to call it a service, we'll call it a celebration or something else, or a farbrengen if they wanted to use the Yiddish term. And we don't want rabbis, because rabbis are old men with white beards who tell you what to do. There's a wonderful essay by the Israeli author Ari Alon in his book. In Hebrew it's called Al-Madi, in English it's called From Jerusalem to the Edge of Heaven. And in this essay he describes the difference between two concepts in Hebrew, Rabbanut and Ribonut. Rabbanut means the rabbinate, external authority, someone else telling you how to live your life. Ribonut means self-authority, self-actualization, being able to run your own life, autonomy and dignity. And so for a secular Jew like Ari Alon, many Israeli Jews, and certainly some of our secular Jews in the diaspora or in the United States and Canada, their secularism meant no authority, no external authority, and no rabbis. At the same time, those who had come out of a reform or conservative background but were secularized, identified perhaps as humanistic Jews, we'll talk about that terminology in a little bit, they liked the idea of what a rabbi could provide. After all, the reform movement had radically changed what a rabbi does. Traditionally, when a rabbi is ordained, they ask 2 questions and get 2 answers. The first question is, Yoreh, can he teach? The answer is Yoreh, he can teach. And then Yadin, can he judge? Yadin, he can judge. Because the role of the rabbi for most communities before modern times was not to give good sermons or visit people in the hospital. It was to decide Jewish law. They were a dayan, they were a judge. So the questions you asked when you ordained them was, can he teach? Yes, and can he judge? Can he fulfill the law? But the reform movement, beginning 200 years ago, greatly reduced or eliminated this concept of Jewish law as deciding what people would do. And we've also experienced in our own lifetimes the kind of things that modern rabbis do. Very rarely are they consulted, even in a conservative synagogue, for what is the law on this topic. Much more often what they find themselves doing is teaching, giving sermons to inspire and educate, teaching both young and old, providing counseling, leading ceremonies. Is there anything about that that a secular or humanistic Jew or leader couldn't do? After all, if it walks like a rabbi and quacks like a rabbi and fulfills the needs that a rabbi fulfills, then maybe a humanistic community or even a movement of secular humanistic Judaism could have rabbis to fulfill that role. Not just teachers, not just expert teachers, but actually rabbis doing the kind of things that rabbis do. That's why we started our rabbinic program now 25 years ago, 1992. And we've ordained a couple dozen rabbis, actually over that, 3 dozen if you count Israel and North America. And what we do in our communities is we are guides. I see myself as an authority but not authoritarian. You know, authoritarian means telling you what to do. An authority means someone who knows what they're talking about. And we rely on authorities all the time. You may have doctors. You may have lawyers. You may have college professors. These are people who've studied the material and who know how to convey it and can help you. That's what a humanistic and secular rabbi does. We are people who have studied and learned, who have some expertise and training, and who can help you get the most out of your experience. When I work with wedding couples, my job is not to fit their names into a script that I've written. My job is to find out from them, what do they want in their ceremony? Maybe both the groom and the bride want to break a glass at the end. Maybe the bride's worried she can't see her feet under her dress, and she doesn't want to try to break a glass. That's fine. But my job is to find out from them what they want and to help fulfill what they want to see. I've had weddings where I'm like the MC and I say very little, because they have friends do readings and talk about the history of their couplehood and facilitate the breaking of the glass and other elements. And I've had weddings where I do almost all the talking. And that's fine, it's what they want. I'm there to facilitate their experience. So I think that our redefinition of rabbi is part of the historical concept. After all, rabbi originally means teacher or expert. And so that's what we do. But our approach is different in that we are facilitating that ribonut, that self-authorization of dignity, as opposed to imposing a rabbanut, an authority from outside. The second word to look at is the concept of religion. We actually had an issue of our journal in 2002 that asked the question, is humanistic Judaism a religion? Most of the answers said yes. I took the contrary position and said not so simple. But it's an important question for us to think about. When the reform movement started, both in Europe and in America, they were grappling with this question of how can Jews be citizens of their country and still be different? They didn't want to simply become Germans who were part of a Christian denomination. They wanted to maintain a distinct identity. And so one of the approaches that was taken was to say that we are Germans of the Mosaic faith. We are Americans of the Jewish religion. And if you were part of the reform movement in the 1880s through the 1930s, they actually had a platform called the Pittsburgh Platform that said, we no longer consider ourselves a nation, we are just a religion. Our fellow Jews are our co-religionists. Now, whether they actually follow something that resembles what we do religiously is a different question, because Orthodox Judaism and Reform Judaism are very different. And secular socialist Yiddishist Judaism, or Jewishness, is very different from Reform Judaism. But the category they felt comfortable with was saying Judaism is a religion. And so you hear about the three great Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Whenever I hear someone talk about that, I think of a rhyme from Sesame Street in my youth. One of these things is not like the other. Because if you're Christian, you can be Korean, or white European, or Nigerian, or Indonesian. And if you're Muslim, you can be Indonesian, or Pakistani, or Egyptian, or Nigerian, or Bosnian. Those are all multi-ethnic religions. But Judaism is both a religion and a sense of peoplehood, ethnic identity. We've referred historically to Am Yisrael, the people, the nation of Israel. There's just a sense that Yahadut, Jewishness, is a quality of who you are, and not just an ism, a set of beliefs. Well, if that's the case, then how we understand what religion means to us, or later on what Judaism means to us, has to shift too. Now, religion could be a set of beliefs. And if you ask people on the street, this is one of my arguments, in this issue of humanistic Judaism is a religion or not, most people said, yes, we are. I said, well, not so fast. First of all, if you ask people on the street, what's religion about? The first answer you might get is God, or the supernatural, or heaven, or some version like that. And so if that's your definition of religion, you'll need to think a bit about whether we would fit into that concept. Now, if you read the dictionary, you'll see multiple definitions. And if you get to definition number 3, it will describe a community of shared beliefs and practices and calendar and values. Well, we would fit into that definition, but most people don't use that dictionary definition number 3. We also don't necessarily do things religiously. I mean, we might, watch a TV show that comes on at a certain time religiously, although that's not the case anymore either. But we might go to our bagels on Sunday morning, brunch, religiously, but we're doing that sort of tongue-in-cheek. We don't do it with a sense of awe, a sense of commandedness, the way that we think of other people doing things religiously. And if we asked our members in our various secular and humanistic Jewish communities across the country, are you a religious person? My guess is most would say, well, I'm not what you mean by religion, if you mean what most people mean, then no, I'm not a religious person in that sense. So it's not quite so simple to say, yes, we're a religion, no problem. However, I will say that just as the rabbi is fulfilling the roles a rabbi fulfills, for those involved in secular and humanistic Jewish communities, their community fulfills the needs that religion meets. What does religion do? It binds people together. In fact, the word religion is from the same root as ligament, what connects things. It binds groups and individuals together. It provides a sense of calendar and the flow of time. It provides a sense of meaning and purpose in life. It answers big questions. It gives you the strength you need to deal with adversity. All of these are things that a humanistic approach to life and a connection to one's Jewish cultural identity provide. So we meet the needs religion meets. And as another article in this issue pointed out, if an alien anthropologist came down from another planet and was studying human behavior phenomenologically, and they witnessed what a secular and humanistic Jewish community did, they would classify it in the religion category, because it's doing the things that religions do, and it's meeting the needs that religions meet. But it's not so simple. So that's why I highlight this issue to say that it's an open question. It's one that's an ongoing conversation. Just because we published a journal issue 17 years ago doesn't mean that people aren't still asking the questions. As I mentioned last night, we had a conference 30 years ago on the balance of humanistic Judaism and Jewish tradition, and we're still talking about it, and we'll continue to talk about it going forward. So, a third term to explore defining is the word Judaism. I alluded to this a little bit earlier, that this concept of Judaism is not simply an ism, a set of beliefs. In some ways, it's closer to Hellenism. Hellenism was the culture of the Hellenes, the Greeks. It was not only their pantheon of gods, but it was also their language, their food, their architecture, their cultural values, their cultural creativity, and their plays and literature. It was not simply their religious beliefs. Again, one of our challenges is that we've been trained to think of Judaism as a religion, one of the three great religions. Even though two of them are 1 billion people and one of them is about 15 million people, still we like to be classified in the big category. Well, Judaism has a complex evolution. People have sometimes thought of Judaism as a race or a biological marker, and you'll still get people who talk about Jewish genealogy in terms of genetics and genetic markers. That does appear. You do still hear the vocabulary sometimes of who looks Jewish or doesn't look Jewish. I will point out that Ethiopian Jews, or Yemeni Jews, or Bukharan Jews from Central Asia, or my father's family comes from Syria, Syrian Jews, Iraqi Jews, they don't, quote, look Jewish from an Ashkenazi perspective. One of the issues we're trying to move beyond in the organized Jewish world is a phenomenon called Ashkenormativity. You might have heard the phrase something is heteronormative, where it's assuming everyone is heterosexual. Ashkenormative is assuming that everyone's Ashkenazi, everyone eats bagels, everyone eats lox, and so on, and everyone speaks Yiddish and has those references. Now, for American Jews, the vast majority of American Jews are of Ashkenazi background, but that isn't the case in Israel. In fact, the majority of Jews in Israel are from Sephardi or Mizrahi Eastern background, either had roots in Spain or had roots in the Middle East, or in Ethiopia for that matter. So Ashkenormative is something we have to get beyond. Who looks Jewish is something we have to get beyond. And to some extent, the genetics of who's Jewish we have to get beyond. After all, how did those Yemeni Jews, those Iraqi Jews, start looking differently? It wasn't because of the water. It wasn't because of the food. It was because they married local people. If you've studied the genetics, it actually turns out that the Y chromosome markers will indicate a Jewish fatherhood, but what's called mitochondrial DNA, which is the DNA that's in the egg and only comes from the mother, indicates many of the women came from the local population. And so the fact that Indian Jews or Yemeni Jews look different is because they married local people. Intermarriage is not new. It's very old in Jewish life. That's how we look differently. That's how we have to get beyond this concept of Judaism as a race or a purely ethnic identity. But it also isn't a purely religious identity either. As was pointed out in one of the readings in our Shabbat service last night, the religious beliefs of Jews are very different, even between two Jews, let alone communities of Jews or different styles of Judaism. Their religious practices are different, and they've changed over time. To assume that the Judaism of animal sacrifice in Jerusalem is basically the same as the Judaism of the Upper West Side of Manhattan, or the Judaism of Israel, or the Judaism of the kibbutz, those are radically different approaches to celebrating life, belief, human values, the role of people in the universe, what we're supposed to do to find meaning in life. So to call that all one religion, I think, is complicated. In the end, the most satisfying definition of what Judaism means, I find, is to think of it as a family identity. Sometimes people use the fancy word peoplehood. That's another way to say more or less the same thing. If Judaism is a family identity, then there is a sort of ethnic ancestry descent component to it, but it's not limited to those descended from that perspective, from a biological sense. Even people who converted to being Jewish under Orthodox practices had some elements of joining a family. You got a new title. You became a Ben Avraham, or a Bat Sarah, a son of Abraham, or a daughter of Sarah. You went through a kind of rebirth experience in going to the mikveh, the ritual bath, for men actually having a kind of circumcision. Even if it was ceremonial, if you'd already been done in a hospital, there was still a kind of rebirth process. You got a new name, a Hebrew name, right? So you're joining the family. People have been adopted into Jewish life. People can be adopted into Judaism. They can convert into Judaism. They can join the family. So if you think of Judaism as a family identity, there will be some people who do not recognize every branch of the family. Right? Some parts of the family have disowned other parts of the family. You will get other parts of the family that are open and welcoming to new spouses that join who want to be even tangentially or peripherally connected, who are Jewish by marriage but not by identity themselves. They're part of the broader sense of family. I find that Judaism as a family identity includes language and food and culture, and in many varied forms. Some of my family grew up in Persia, and when they celebrated Purim, they had a tradition of writing the name of Haman on the bottom of their shoes, so that all day long they would be scuffing out the name of Haman. Now, is it illegitimate for me to adopt that practice for myself or my children or my school? No, it's part of the extended family culture. We're living in a golden age right now for Jewish food. There are all these marvelous Jewish cookbooks and restaurants and creative fusion cuisines out there. And I don't care if your parents came from Minsk. You can enjoy Middle Eastern Jewish food. That's fine. It's part of your extended family. So that's our approach to Judaism in a broader sense as a family cultural identity. The next term I wanted to explore is the concept of Torah. Now, technically, the Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. But in rabbinic practice, it could be both larger and smaller. You will find passages in the Torah itself that refer to the Torah of leprosy, or the Torah of damages. That means the law of damages, or even more directly, the teaching on damages. Anyone who went to Hebrew school might remember the word for teacher in Hebrew is moreh for male, or morah for female. Morah and Torah have the same root. So Torah at its basis means the teaching. Eventually it became applied to the Torah Moshe, the Torah of Moses, which is understood to be those first 5 books. But in rabbinic practice it went even wider, because they believed, as I mentioned last night, in 2 Torahs, a written Torah and an oral Torah. Now, the oral Torah was not originally written down. It was by word of mouth. It was the body of rabbinic teachings of how to do the laws. So if the Torah text itself says you will not kindle a fire on Shabbat, does that mean you have to put out all the fires and do Shabbat in the dark? Or does it mean you can light a fire before Shabbat and allow it to keep burning? Well, the Torah text itself doesn't tell you. You need the oral Torah of rabbinic commentary to help explain. And they claim that this Torah, or its interpretive principles, goes back to Moses on Sinai. So it has a pedigree, like the written one, but it also has the flexibility to have new ideas and interpretations. So one discussion you find in the Talmud section on Shabbat is, what if I have an oil lamp, and I light the oil lamp before Shabbat, and then I hang a bag of oil over that lamp, and I poke a little hole in the bottom, so that a little drop of oil, every few minutes, falls onto that oil lamp and allows it to keep burning all the way through Shabbat. Am I actively kindling a fire? Or have I set up a machine that runs by itself and so I can allow it to run over the course of Shabbat? Now you see where you get the idea of a Shabbat elevator that runs automatically, or Shabbat timers on lights and ovens, and all of these workarounds that Rabbinic Judaism has explored as modern technology has developed go back to this question of, can you interpret it, and does that still count as Torah? If you're living in an Orthodox setting and they say, I'm studying Torah, they don't just mean the first 5 books. They mean the entire written Bible and that body of rabbinic laws in the Talmud and the Mishnah that they call the oral Torah. So what do we mean by Torah in a humanistic Jewish community? Well, we try to keep it a little more focused on the written sources. But we also think of them differently. Remember, the traditional approach says that the Torah was given to Moses on Sinai. Moses was like the stenographer, or simply the deliverer if God wrote it himself. He was the conduit but not the author. From our perspective, people write things. And sometimes ancient books had more than one author and more than one layer of development. You might have had editors or interpreters who go in and change the text. Based on contemporary scholarship, there's an ongoing debate right now between two theories of where the Torah came from. Was it written in multiple documents that were combined together, something called the documentary hypothesis? Or was there a core narrative but alternative versions of that that's called the supplementary hypothesis? But in either version, it was written by people in a certain time and place with a certain agenda. I'll give you just a couple examples. One is the story of Lot and his daughters. You may remember the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. You know, this town that had this terrible evil of inhospitability to guests and homosexual behavior. They were condemned to be destroyed, and Lot and his daughters fled the city. His wife also fled, but she made the mistake of looking back, and she was turned into a pillar of salt. This helps us know, by the way, this is probably an origin story for the Dead Sea, or also known as the Salt Sea, and why there's such salt flats, and why that desert is so dry in that part of the world. This is an origin story for that phenomenon in natural geography. Lot and his daughters wind up in a cave, and they think the entire world has been destroyed. They have to start over. So Lot's daughters get him drunk. And the first night, the oldest daughter sleeps with him. The second night, they get him drunk again, and the younger daughter sleeps with him. They then produce children out of that incest. The first daughter's child is named Moab, from my father, and becomes the ancestor of the Moabites. And the second one is called Ben-Ami, the son of my people, and becomes known as the ancestor of the Ammonites, another people that was a rival to Israel. Now, do you think that the Ammonites and the Moabites told this story about their origins? Probably not. You see, this is not history. This is political genealogy. This is saying that those other people out there are bastards. They're sons of incest. They're polluted from the root, and we hate them. And here's why. This is Torah narrative not as history, but as, again, political genealogy. So when people write that, it makes sense. We understand they have an agenda, so we have to try to find out what that agenda was. Another example of how interpretation makes a difference. There's a couple of passages in the Bible, in the Torah specifically, describing the pilgrimage festivals. There are 3 times a year that the males are supposed to go up to Jerusalem, offer their sacrifices, and do their pilgrimage. The text says in the Hebrew, 3 times a year, and this is how it appears in a rabbinic Bible today, 3 times a year you will be seen by God at these festivals. The problem is, for those who know Hebrew, that it includes the word et. Et in Hebrew is a direct object marker. So if I open the book, I don't just open the book. In Hebrew, I would open et the book, which means the book is the direct object of what I'm doing. In the Hebrew phrasing, it says, Yira'eh et Yahweh. You will see or be seen God. But God is the direct object. So the original meaning of the text probably meant, you will see God. God's not doing the seeing. You're not being seen by him. He is being seen. But for later generations, that was unthinkable. People can't see God. No way. But I can't change the text. The et is in the letters, and we have to copy it exactly the way it's written. But maybe, if I change the voweling, I can take the active, you will see God, and make it a passive, you will be seen by God. That's how, who tells you what it means makes a big difference. We know this with the U.S. Constitution, right? The wording sometimes matters less than who gets to tell you what it means. The rabbis, they got to tell you what the Torah means. You only saw it through the rabbinic lens. Our approach is, let's look at the text as it is, what we can find historically, what we can think about it rationally, and let's see what it actually says. We may find inspiration. We may find alienation. But we'll find what's really there. We'll have the dignity of our real roots. So, the last term I want to talk about that has some challenges when it comes to definitions is the term God. If you ask, what does God mean? You'll get a lot of different answers. Some of them, by the way, might look a lot like those rabbi faces that we saw a minute ago, right? The old man with a white beard on a throne saying no. That's one image of God. Now, this is not the only image of God, even in Jewish tradition. If you went back to the Middle Ages, you had two very divergent streams of thought. You had a Jewish rationalist philosophical school along the lines of Maimonides, who would say God does not have a body, does not have a face, does not have any features. If the Bible refers to God's hand, or his arm, or his finger, or his back, or his legs, or any other of the imagery that shows up from time to time, it's all a metaphor, it's all an allegory, because God has no form. God is not anything that we can really understand, said Maimonides. The most you can do is say what God is not. You sort of define it negatively, like carving a sculpture. You take out the other stuff, and what's left will be God. It was almost like an Aristotelian prime mover, the beginning of the universe, that started things and runs them. Maimonides had to go a little farther because he did have to say God wrote a Torah, and God parted the Red Sea and did things, but he didn't do it manually. He did it distantly, intellectually. That was one school of thought in the Middle Ages about God. Another school of thought was involved in a much more mystical approach. This is the authorship and the community around the Zohar, or Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. You might have heard of Madonna's interest in Kabbalah in recent times. Kabbalah said that there were ways to access an experience of God. There was indeed an unknowable God way before everything. But that unknowable God found ways to emanate himself into the world, to display an aspect of judgment, or an aspect of strength, or an aspect of support, or an aspect of compassion. These are different ways that God emanates himself into the world. One of these ways of emanation, by the way, was personified as feminine. It was called the Shekhinah, the divine presence. And so sometimes in modern Jewish feminist circles, you'll hear people changing the blessing formula. Instead of Baruch atah Adonai, they'll say Brucha at Shekhinah, using that medieval term for one version of God's presence in the world in a feminine aspect. That's the opposite of Maimonides, right? Maimonides would have had a cow if you had tried to explain how God had a feminine and a masculine. He would have said, no, beyond gender, not that at all. But the mystics didn't like Maimonides either. His Guide for the Perplexed, which was a work of philosophical erudition that explored these concepts of not defining God positively, was burned by some rabbis, not by the church, by rabbis who thought it was heretical to say that there's no way God ever had a body anywhere, and that what the Torah says about God's hand and arm is simply allegory. So we've been arguing over what do we mean by God for a long time. Is God the thunder God of the early stories in the Bible? Is God the only God that's out there? As we'll see when we look at the Ten Commandments, you may remember one of those commandments says, you will have no other gods before me. Does that mean there are no other gods? Well, no other gods before me would imply that they just have to sit in the back. They're subordinate. Or, I don't want you looking at any other gods. Remember, God is a jealous God? Why would he be jealous if there's no one else to look at? You know, if it's you and your spouse on a desert island, why be jealous? But if it's you and your spouse in a nightclub, then maybe you'll feel jealous if they're looking at or connecting to or talking to anyone else. In fact, the phrase is even used sometimes in the Hebrew Bible that the Hebrew people committed snoot. They were whoring, they were prostituting themselves after other gods. They were being promiscuous after other gods. That's not how we think of the Bible. That's not how we think of the Hebrew God. But at one time, the Hebrew God may have been one of many gods. And maybe he was the only one the Hebrews were allowed to talk to. So God has evolved over the centuries, and he's evolved even in modern times, even as some of the texts have stayed the same. So what I'm showing here, by the way, on the screen is a recommended reading packet that was hopefully distributed before the seminar for people that registered today. We can make sure that you get it by email as well. I'm going through it also because I assume that a few people do the reading and most people don't do the reading. So it's worth reviewing. One of the pieces I included in here is an article I wrote some years ago. I called it Our Quarterback, Our King. This is a play on the traditional prayer, Our Father, Our King, Avinu Malkeinu. What do I mean by the quarterback? Well, if you read the traditional prayer service or a Torah text, you get examples of God as the quarterback. He calls all the plays. He makes everything happen on the field with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. If you obey his commands, he will reward you with calling your number on plays and giving you lots of statistics and touchdowns. If you violate his commandments, he might lay you out there for the defensive back to crush, or he might send you to the bench. But God is an intervening, active God who designs and calls plays, who does things in the world. That makes sense from the traditional perspective and belief. In most modern theology, that isn't the kind of God people believe in. Because if you believed in that kind of God, you have to explain how the quarterback allows a Holocaust, or how the quarterback allows a child to get a genetic disease. There's a wonderful book that asks great questions, and again, I disagree with the answers. It's called When Bad Things Happen to Good People by Harold Kushner. Some of you may have read it. He's a liberal rabbi. He had a child that had this disease where the children aged really quickly and died in their early teens. Very terrible condition, very difficult. And he had to grapple with his faith. How could I believe in a God that would afflict this infant, this child? They didn't do anything wrong. And even if I did something wrong, why make the child suffer? In the end, what Kushner concludes is that he can't believe in a God that runs everything. He can't believe in the quarterback God that could have done things differently. Instead, what he believes in is one of two other options. Either the coach God. You see, the coach God sits on the sidelines, doesn't intervene on the field, but he designs the plays. He makes the plans. It's up to people to execute. But the coach God has a role in seeing how things run. Maybe sets the rules up or agrees on the rules with how things are going to run. The other option is the cheerleader God. What does a cheerleader God do? A cheerleader God encourages you. Says, go, go, go! But doesn't intervene on the field. Doesn't even design the plays. Is there to provide the emotional support that you long for. It's almost, and this is a little bit insulting, so I probably shouldn't say it, but I'll say it anyways. It's a little bit like a placebo god. You know what a placebo is in medicine? Where you get a sugar pill and it helps you because you think it helps you, even if it's not actually doing anything physically in your body. That's the kind of God you sometimes hear about in modern theology, where it's a God that encourages you, that supports you, that gives you the emotional support when you need it, but doesn't intervene in the world. Now, you can believe whatever you want. I have no problem accepting that as a concept of how the universe works. The challenge becomes, what do you say about that God? Not just in English, but in Hebrew. Not just in prose, but in services. Are you still referring to the coach or the quarterback, like the coach or the cheerleader, like they're the quarterback? Or have you changed so that you're now talking about them like a coach or a cheerleader? So here's an example I'm putting on the screen. Here's a summary of some theological options within Reform Judaism. Some may be fortified by accepting all things as God's will. Some may be fortified by a belief that God is limited in power. So illness and death and loss do not come from God, nor can God prevent them. Some may be fortified by a faith that God cares about them and suffers with them, even when God, like a parent, cannot always make things better. So that's a very modified sense. But here's what's in the Reformed Birkat HaMazon, the blessing after meals. Blessed is Adonai our God, sovereign of the universe, who sustains the entire world with goodness, kindness, and mercy. God gives food to all creatures, for God's mercy is everlasting. With abundant goodness we have never lacked, and may we never lack sustenance forever in God's great name. God sustains all, does good to all, and provides food for all the creatures created. Blessed is Adonai who provides food for all. There would seem to be a disconnect, right, between the theology and the content of the prayer service. So that was one question about the quarterback side of God. The other side, I called it our quarterback, our king. Because, as I mentioned, God is often referred to as a king in this liturgy. But you might have noticed in that English translation of the blessing on meals, it didn't use the word king. Did anyone catch what word it used? It used the word sovereign. How does sovereign change things? Two ways. One, sovereign is not gendered, like king is gendered male. And the second is that sovereign is not monarchic. It's not absolutist. We don't live in monarchies anymore. The vast majority of Jews in the world live in democracies of varying levels of democratic value, but they all live in democracies. Well, talking about a king all the time doesn't reflect our reality. When these were written, Jews lived under kings all the time. So imagining God as the King of Kings, Melech HaMelachim from Shalom Aleichem, that makes total sense. But now that we live in democracy, where the power, the sovereignty, is distributed among the citizenry, referring to a king as if that's the only way to understand power and divine authority, that doesn't resonate anymore. And so what you find is not only has the language changed to sovereignty, but even the theology has changed to reflect our political experience. Have you ever heard of an immanent theology? The idea that there's a little bit of God, a spark of divinity in every person? That's reflecting the political reality of power. It's distributed among all the citizens. So having God with all the power up on a throne doesn't work. Having God distributed among all the people, that reflects our sense of how things should run. And it also ennobles us. It's not that God is out there, that God is you. God is me. God is us. It's all a part of us. It's a collective process. Now, the challenge I have, again, you can believe that, that's totally fine. But then it creates other challenges with the wording. Try blessing carbon. We all have carbon atoms in us. Carbon is required for life to exist. We eat carbon, we drink carbon. But if I said, blessed are you carbon, who brings forth the fruit of the vine. Blessed are you carbon, who makes possible life on the world. It would feel kind of odd talking to carbon. It makes more sense talking to a person, an atah, a you, or an at, more so than talking to this disembodied thing. Blessed are you gravity, that keeps my feet on the ground. Now, we might want to express gratitude for gravity, or for carbon, or for fellowship and community. But if we're expressing gratitude for those things, maybe we express it to those people, or we express it to ourselves in words that reflect what we believe. This is, in the end, where there's a divergence between Reform and Reconstructionist Judaism and a secular humanistic Judaism. Because a lot of Reform places will simply redefine, reinterpret, put the English to reflect their values, but keep the Hebrew in the traditional forms. They fall back on that old language, and as I discussed last night, they have a differing value in the balance between continuity with the past and the creativity of living out your own values and expressing them. So, where they would say, this is the Torah that Moses placed before the children of Israel, we wouldn't say that necessarily, because we don't believe Moses wrote the whole thing, or even maybe any of it. So, that is a question of balance. They value the continuity and will say traditional words. We value the living our values. Although, they live their values too. They don't separate men and women, as one example. And we value tradition. We're still reading from Torah scrolls and texts and studying our heritage, even if we don't agree theologically with it. So we both value both, but the balance is going to be different. And so I want to give you one example of an interpretation of a traditional text. This comes from Mordecai Kaplan's book, The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion, I think is the full title. And here's a phrase that he finds in the traditional sources that he feels needs to be redefined. So, if you just read the literal meaning of the words, perfecting the world under the kingdom of the Almighty, that would sound very distant, right? Very monarchic, very authoritarian, and it wouldn't reflect the values of the modern age. So he goes through and interprets, well, what do we mean by perfecting the world? This, by the way, is an early example of that phrase, tikkun olam, used in a modern sense. What does the kingdom mean? What does the Almighty mean? What do we mean by God? After all, the title of the book is The Meaning of God. And so, after a variety of interpretations and explorations, here's his conclusion. Perfecting the world under the kingdom of the Almighty must mean the establishment of a social order that combines the maximum of individual self-realization with the maximum of social occupation. How did he get there? Again, let's look at the words here. Perfecting the world under the kingdom of the Almighty equals establishing a social order that combines the maximum of individual self-realization with the maximum of social occupation. I just have trouble bridging from Almighty to individual self-realization. Don't those seem to be on the opposite end of the philosophical spectrum? Well, the challenge for Kaplan was that he wanted his version of Judaism as a civilization to have continuity with the past. And if he changed the Baruch Atah formula, and if he changed every time it says Almighty to the individual self-actualizing, then it wouldn't feel traditional. Sherwin Wine, who was my teacher, sometimes described Mordecai Kaplan's Reconstructionism as 3 Ds. Dewey, Durkheim, and Davening. Dewey was John Dewey, the pragmatic American philosopher. The second D was Durkheim, Emile Durkheim, the sociologist of religious practice. And Davening was the traditional prayer service. He believed in Dewey's mostly secular philosophy. In fact, Dewey coined the term Reconstruction in philosophy that Mordecai Kaplan then used. He also liked Durkheim's concept of a religious community defined by rituals and practices. But Kaplan was raised Orthodox, and he was a teacher at the Jewish Theological Seminary of Conservative Judaism for 50 years. He was committed to davening, to saying the traditional words. So if he had to say the traditional words, maybe he could redefine what he meant. So when he said God, he meant this. When he said kingdom, he meant that. And that's how he could keep his davening. Our approach has been, yes, words have some flexibility. We've talked about redefining Judaism, rabbi, and so on. But at a certain point, they also retain some of their old meaning. You can't simply make words mean what you want them to mean, a la Alice in Wonderland. And the word God has some baggage, has some meaning. It falls back into that trap of the old man on the throne. So in our communities, we have largely not used that terminology, certainly in English, but even in the Hebrew, because we see all of the associations with it of the quarterback and the king that don't get left behind, even if you say it means something else. So that's a quick approach to our use of certain words and how we define them. There are plenty of other words that are part of what we do, secular, humanistic, congregation, that we could explore a bit more. But it's at 10:35 right now. I wanted to take a few minutes to open up for any comments, questions, or reactions before we go on to talking about collections of words, aka literature, the Torah, the Bible, and specifically how we approach liturgy and celebration. Okay. And so again, the question is related to one that was asked last night as well. What's the difference between humanist and secular? I'm not someone who gets caught up on terminology all the time. Some people get very upset about the difference between liberal and progressive and how you parse out those terms. For many people, secular and humanistic are basically synonymous. They mean someone who believes in the natural world, believes in the authority of people to be in charge of their life, who feels a sense of responsibility to other people in the world, and who wants to, again, affirm human autonomy. So, whether they say secular or humanistic, they mean more or less the same things. However, there are different sort of subtle resonances or associations. So for some, secular has a kind of anti-religious or non-religious concept to it. No rabbis, no congregations. That's what they mean by secular. For others, humanistic has a sense of positive beliefs to it. Not just that I believe in the natural world and human autonomy, but also a sense of ethics and values, a sense of responsibility to the environment, to human rights, and other positive beliefs, where secular can be a kind of negative self-definition. Honestly, some of it is branding and wording. If I call myself a secular rabbi, that gets some attention. What? That seems like a paradox. How could you be secular and a rabbi? If I call myself a humanistic rabbi, it's defining myself by what I do believe, and not by what I don't or what I'm not. So just as the pro-life and pro-choice movements have chosen positive terminology for each of their perspectives, so too sometimes we choose positive terminology for what we do. I'm comfortable, I was raised with the term humanistic Judaism, and I know what I mean by that, but I understand that other people might call themselves secular Jews. And what they mean by what they do in their secular Judaism is basically what I do in my humanistic Judaism. So I don't get too caught up on the subtleties, but some people use the terms in different ways. As an example, in Israel, the word chiloni, which is often translated as secular, has a complexity to it. It really means not orthodox, lo dati. It means not following rabbinic law. So paradoxically, a Reform Jew in Israel might count as chiloni, as secular, in that categorization. If you try calling Reform Jews here secular in English, they get very offended and upset, because they're not. Their Judaism is a religious Judaism. So what we mean by secular shifts as well. One last valence to it is the Yiddish. The classical term in Yiddish for secular was weltlich. Weltlich, you can hear the word welt in there, means worldly. That means both this worldly, but also cosmopolitan, part of a universal human civilization. If you were a weltliche Yid, you were a secular Jew or a worldly Jew. You were not limited to only Jewish things, people, contexts, and circulation. So there's a little bit of aspect of all of that in what we do. So we're sort of a schizophrenic movement. We have a Society for Humanistic Judaism, and we have an International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. They are doing the same things. I'm a rabbi of a congregation that's a member of the society, and I'm the dean of the Institute for Secular Judaism. I'm both. So it's sort of what hat you choose to wear. But I think that it's still a value to have both terms, and some connect with more one than the other. I hope we can agree that we're all pulling in the same direction, and then we can collaborate on what's important. Right. So the question is, how do you answer someone who says being Jewish is just a religion, like being Catholic or Methodist or Sunni Islam? Well, a couple of answers to that thought. Some of the evidence I gave earlier about how when you convert, you get a new pedigree and a sense of identity and a rebirth, that's part of it. There's always this sense of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, going back a long time. I'll sometimes ask them, what's Jewish about Yiddish? It's a language. It's not theology. It's not ritual practice. It's part of an ethnic culture. And it's Jewish because it's associated with Jewish people. It's what they did. I sometimes will also ask them, is there Catholic food? Are there Catholic jokes? Or Catholic languages? But there's clearly Jewish languages, Jewish jokes, Jewish food, Jewish material culture. So that identifies Jewishness as a peoplehood that has a particular culture, not just a set of religious beliefs. And the last example I'll give derives from pop culture. Are Adam Sandler and Amy Schumer Jewish? Yes. Do they believe in God? Who knows? Who knows if Adam Sandler or Woody Allen or any of these people believe in God? Who knows? It's irrelevant to the question of whether or not they're Jewish. Whether they keep kosher or not, whether they light Shabbat candles or not, what they believe or not. What kind of a religion is it where you don't have to believe or ritually perform anything to qualify as part of that religion? We're not defined by our beliefs. 80% of American Jews do not light Shabbat candles regularly. 80% of American Jews do not keep kosher. Most American Jews don't attend synagogue on a regular basis. In fact, 20% of American Jews, self-identified, never attend synagogue, not even high holidays. But they're still counted as Jewish. So what kind of a religion is it if you're saying it's only a religion where you don't have to believe anything, and you don't have to practice anything, and you don't have to recite anything to still qualify? Well, it seems to me it's not quite a religion. It's something, maybe religion plus, or that's one aspect, but not all of it. That's why we say when you think of Judaism as a culture, that includes religion, but it's not limited to or defined by religion. I'll give you one other example. Is a Reuben sandwich Jewish food? Feels like it, sounds like it, tastes like it. Meat and milk, right? Cheese, Russian dressing. What does its kosher status have to do with its Jewish status? Those are separate categories of thought. So being Jewish is more complicated. Think of it like being Irish or Italian. Is there a particular religious perspective associated with being Italian historically? Well, yeah, it's the Catholic Church, right? But can you be a non-Catholic Italian? Sure. So why not Jewish too? Yes. And then we'll come to our break. Yep.
You were giving statistics a moment ago. Do you know a statistic for how many Jews do not believe in God?
Okay. The question is there a statistic for how many Jews don't believe in God? Actually, there is. In 2013, the Pew Forum on Religion and American Life did a large survey called the Survey of Jewish Americans. It actually has a lot of really interesting details in it. It might make a nice adult ed discussion to sort of read the report, or it's divided by chapters and topics. You could just parse it one session at a time like that. And in that survey, they asked all kinds of interesting questions. For example, they asked, is being Judaism mainly a religion, mainly ancestry and culture, or a combination of both? And it turns out that about 60% of all American Jews said it's mainly ancestry and culture. Only about 15% said it's mainly religion, and the balance said a combination of the two. So that's an interesting definitional question, that American Jews themselves self-define their Jewishness as ancestry and culture, not religion. Another question they asked, though, was, do you believe in God or a universal spirit? And I love the way they phrased that question, because some people don't like the word God, but they believe in something. They might call it a universal spirit. So they gave them three options. I certainly believe in God or universal spirit. I believe, but I'm not sure. And I do not believe. Those were the three options. Jews were way overrepresented compared to the general population in saying do not believe. And they were given a choice of I don't know. But 20% of American Jews, maybe 19% of American Jews, said they do not believe with that kind of a question. Whereas in the general population, only about 8 or 9% said they do not believe. So our proportion of people who, given the choice of yes, maybe, and no, chose no at a much higher proportion than the general population. So when you hear people say, well, I go to the synagogue, but I don't really believe, that's not uncommon at all. Remember, I said there's 20% that never go to synagogue. There's 20% that don't believe in a God. But that's not the same 20%. Some of the ones that don't go believe, and some of the ones that don't believe go. Yeah, follow up.
I'm not sure you actually answered my specific question, although that was very interesting. You said 20% of the respondees compared to the general population.
No. Of the general population, 9% of people said they do not believe in a God. Of all the Jews in America, 20% said they did not believe in a God. So it's a much higher proportion compared to the general population. But again, and that's about 1 million Jews. If you've got 5+ million Jews in America.
Where did the babies come in?
What?
Where did the babies come in?
Oh, the babies, I think we're also in the 20-30% range. So I could look up the numbers in the break. But yeah, the babies are also an interesting category. And might be fertile ground for us as well. Okay, so it's about 10 to 11 right now. What I'd like to do is let's try and do a 10-minute break. We keep to 12 minutes. Let's keep it to our 10 minutes. And when we come back, we'll turn to talking about the Torah and the Bible and about liturgy and how we express what we